Hi, my name is Lanya McKittrick, and I'm going to be speaking with you today about IEP development. A little bit about my background. For those of you who don't know me, I am the mom of 4 boys. 2 of them are deafblind due to Usher syndrome. Connor's 21 and Dalton is 13. There's a picture on the screen here with my family, my husband Todd, my children Connor, Cole, Hunter, and Dalton. We live in Seattle, Washington, and our 2 oldest boys are in college. I'm also a special education researcher specializing in deafblindness, the founder of Lane of Inquiry. My research focus is IEP collaboration. I'm the chair of the board of the Usher Syndrome Coalition. I also provide family support, both through Lane of Inquiry and the coalition. I'm also the affiliate of NFADB, and I am an adjunct faculty member at the University of Northern Colorado. I teach a course entitled IEPs in the Collaborative Process. So today I'm going to be going over 3 things. The first is an overview of special education law. The second is a review of the IEP components. And both of these first 2 topics are just general overviews, not specific to deafblindness. And then the third thing I'm going to do is talk about some deafblind specific IEP considerations. So to get us started, I wanted to mention that there are 3 laws that come into play for our children in the classroom. The first is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This act was passed in 1975, which was in that era was known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. The most recent addendum of IDEA was passed in 2004. The IDEA is a law that makes available a free and appropriate public education to children with disabilities throughout the nation. Before IDEA existed, children with disabilities were not served in the general education classroom. They were typically put in group homes and other things, and they were segregated from their peers. IDEA governs how states and public agencies provide both early intervention, special education, and related services. There are several parts of IDEA. Part C of IDEA is the part that dictates infants and toddlers birth through age 2 and their families and the services that they will receive. This is where the IFSP comes into play. Children aged 3 through 21 receive special education services under IDEA Part B. There are also other laws that I mentioned. The next one is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that was passed in 1973. And the last one is the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed in 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act, you might know it as the law that protects individuals in public places, such as ensuring access into buildings, ramps, accessibility, and such. 504 plans, the purpose is pretty similar to an IEP. The purpose is to level the playing field, prevent discrimination on the basis of any disability, to provide appropriate educational services to the same extent as the needs of non-disabled peers. In order to qualify for a 504 plan, a student needs to have an evaluation done. In a 504 plan, students get similar protections as those in an IEP, but they're not quite as substantial. And I'll go through what an IEP is in a little bit. Students get non-discrimination protections, some limited procedural safeguards. There are more safeguards in an IEP. Students get accommodations, and then possibly some related services. I mentioned a minute ago, Individualized Family Services Plan, or an IFSP. So that's the plan from birth to age 3. An IFSP describes services that the infant or toddler and the family will receive. So this is a very family-oriented plan. The plan has an option to identify resources, priorities, and concerns, and then includes outcomes and services related to a child's early intervention and development. It's reviewed at 6-month intervals or more often if necessary. It's developed in a similar manner, timeframe as an IEP, but this whole plan is very family specific. An IEP, on the other hand, this is the document that is for children who are aged 3 through 21 that qualify under one of the categories. Deafblindness is one of those categories. An IEP provides the foundation for a student's appropriate education and assures the student will benefit from special education through full participation. The teams must review an IEP at least once a year. I recommend that teams meet more than once a year, particularly for our children who are deafblind, because oftentimes the team is quite large, and situations change quite frequently for our kiddos, and so it's important for us to review the progress on a regular basis. So I want to move in a little bit about what is the IEP process? What is involved in developing an IEP? So there's two main things: the document itself and the IEP meeting. I'll do another presentation about some tips about the IEP meeting, but I wanted to talk about the content of an IEP and what's in that document. So a document, or the IEP, is the meeting serves as a communication vehicle between the parents and the school and the entire team, and it enables them to all be equal participants. So IDEA has sections in it that enable and encourage both parent and student feedback in the IEP. And that feedback is really important so that the team can make joint informed decisions regarding appropriate goals for the students, how often the student will be, and to the extent this child would be involved in the general education setting, and what services and supports that child needs. The law requires that every child that receives special education services must have an IEP. So who's on the IEP team? So you can see the visual on the screen. The student is at the center of all of this. This is the student focused IEP. The student should be, as early as possible, I'm a proponent of student being involved in the IEP, even at a young age, even being there, participating in a small amount. So the student is part of the IEP. The special education teachers, someone who can evaluate and interpret the evaluation results. Oftentimes that's a school psychologist or someone of that nature. Any others who have knowledge of special expertise about the child. So that could be someone from the State Deafblind Project, maybe another family member, or another parent of a child who's deafblind, who has knowledge about deafblindness, who knows information about the child that can bring that to the team. The parents or guardians, of course. If the child's of transition age, a transition services agency should be involved. There's also a school system representative. So that's the local education representative of the district, and a regular education teacher. So someone in the general education setting. And so you can see, and then any related service provider. So, for my kids' IEPs that were very large, we have currently have a lot of related service providers. So you can see how this team is quite large and can benefit from everyone collaborating and working together. There are 6 principles of IDEA. The first one is zero reject. And this is a rule against a school or district excluding any student. The second one is providing a non-discriminatory evaluation. So making sure that schools and districts evaluate students fairly to find out if they have a disability, and if so, how does it impact his or her education? So making sure that the parents are involved in that evaluation, that the evaluation is appropriate, and making sure that it's in the child's, the primary language is considered during the evaluation. Free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. I'm sure you've all heard of that. This is a rule requiring schools to provide an individualized education to meet the unique needs of each student. So not just, this is what we provide students, all students who are deafblind. This means that the IEP needs to be very individualized for each student. I'll go over that a little bit more in a minute. The next one is least restrictive environment, or you guys all probably have heard the acronym LRE. This is a rule requiring students to educate students with disabilities with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. So this means that we should do everything possible to put services and supports in place so that students can be with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. The next principle is procedural due process, and this is a rule that provides safeguards for students and their families against school actions, including the right to sue in court. So if a family does not agree with what the IEP team is proposing, they have options to, file a state complaint, file due process, go to mediation, and they have other means in order to resolve a potential conflict. I also mentioned this earlier, but one of the principles of IDEA is parent and student participation. So this is a rule that requires schools to collaborate with students and parents in development of an IEP. So now I would argue through my research that sometimes what is put into practice is not necessarily what I think is the intent of the law. I think when the law was written, it was meant for parents and students to have equal participation in the IEP. And I know, being a parent myself, that oftentimes that is not what how we feel in an IEP meeting. So a little bit more about FAPE. So free means, the free part of the F means free. And so this means that it will be provided at public expense. Appropriate, what does that mean? So there are a couple of different cases in special education law. The first one is the Board of Education versus Raleigh. And this was a case that went to the Supreme Court in 1982. And I talked about due process. So this is a family that went and filed due process because they felt like their child was not receiving FAPE. So for a very long time, actually up until 2017, this was the actual case law that was the baseline of what are the expectations of an IEP team in determining what level of services is appropriate for a student. And so, unfortunately, that bar was a little bit lower than what I would anticipate. So a lot of people say that it was the Chevrolet and not the Cadillac version of, what are we expected to provide a student. Then there's some other cases. The most recent was in 2007, and this Andrew F. case in Colorado really upped the bar on what FAPE means. So it stretches our thinking as far as, the individualization and the level of services and supports we need to provide in order to ensure FAPE. Again, this is not perfect, but it did raise the bar from the Board of Education versus Raleigh case of 1982. Again, there's a lot of subjectiveness in determining what FAPE is, and oftentimes there are disagreements and conflict that occurs within IEP teams between families and schools in regards to what FAPE should look like for a particular student. The key in all of this is individualization. So I mentioned earlier, not just saying, well, this is what we provide students who are deafblind in our school or district, but really getting to know the students' individualized needs and doing all that we can to provide the services and supports necessary for that unique student. A little more about least restrictive environment, or LRE. What this means generally, I'm making it a lot more simple than it is, but this is what we talk about when we talk about inclusion or mainstreaming. It in the past has also been called integration, which is the opposite of segregation, which is what happened prior to IDEA being passed. So, what services and supports can we provide a student in order for them to be educated in the general education classroom or included as much as they possibly can? So least restrictive environment is complicated though. And a least restrictive environment is really a decision that needs to be discussed between every IEP team. And for some students, a least restrictive environment is not the general education classroom. One example is for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Oftentimes, the least restrictive environment, what the family wants, is for the child to be in a deaf of hard of hearing classroom. And so in that case, the least restrictive environment would be with their deaf peers in a deaf of hard of hearing classroom. So you can see how family input is really important to this. A family input on communication mode and all these other things really go into the individualized discussion about what LRE is for each individual student. So on this screen, I'm showing the continuum of our LRE. So the least restrictive is a general education classroom. And then you can see, some students receive pullout in a resource room. There are also special classes or self-contained classrooms. I mentioned deaf and hard of hearing classrooms, for instance, developmental classrooms, and other options. There are also special schools for students with disabilities where everyone in the school has a disability. Homebound instruction, sometimes hospitals and institutions. So you can see how there is a real large range and continuum of least restrictive environment. Shifting gears to what is in an IEP. So the first thing I tell people is it's really important to start off the IEP process with determining what are the present levels of performance. So what is the child able to do at this point in time, at the current level? So what are their strengths? What are their challenges? What are they able to accomplish and do? And how are they impacted in the classroom? After that happens, it's important for us to also talk about what is the assessment status. So what are the evaluation results? So what do we know presently about both the assessment and what do we know from our observations in the classroom about what the student is able to do and what are their strengths? When I talk about developing IEPs, oftentimes you can go into an IEP meeting and it can feel really deficit based. And so I really urge people to really think about, starting off with the strengths, making sure that you have enough of those and you don't keep the IEP meeting so deficit focused. Then there's measurable annual goals that include benchmarks. So we start with the present levels and what's the assessment status, and then we develop goals. After we develop goals, we then talk about services and supports, such as what accommodations and modifications are necessary in order for the student to be able to reach those goals. And, oftentimes, I hear IEP teams kind of going at this backwards. So they start with the present levels, but then instead of coming up with annual goals, first, they move on to, well, where are we going to place this student? And then we talk about the services and supports. And then after we do that, then we'll talk about goals. But that's actually backwards. We should start with developing the goals first and then figuring out what placement, the general education classroom, we talked about that LRE continuum, talking about, where should that placement be in order to achieve those goals. And then also after we develop those goals, it's going to allow us to better determine what accommodations and modifications we need to put in place. Does a student need additional time on assignments? What supports do they need in order to be able to be successful and access the curriculum in that least restrictive environment that the team has talked about? And then what extent will the student not participate with their non-disabled peers? So then the team, after all of this is put into place, will discuss how often will the child be pulled out for like a resource room setting or related services, or perhaps a student will be in a self-contained classroom for part of the day and then in a general education classroom for the other part of the day. What is that going to look like? We also, in an IEP, discussed any modifications in the administration of assessment. So I'm talking about like those state assessments that students are required to participate in. Sometimes there are modified assessments and that students qualify for. Also in the IEP is projected dates for beginning the services and program modifications. So how often are students receiving these services? Where are they going to be receiving these services, and for how long? And then how is progress towards annual goals going to be measured, and how will parents be informed? And I think this is really important because I hear a lot of conflict occurring. Boy, the IEP meeting went so well. We developed this wonderful IEP meeting, but we stopped and didn't really talk about how we will monitor progress. Who's going to monitor the progress? How are all of this large IEP team going to collaborate in order to monitor progress of these goals? And how are we going to communicate that progress back to the families? And how will students be involved in understanding what progress they are making on their goals? Will the student be responsible at all for being part of any of that process? And then not for all IEPs, but for some students, these categories are part of the IEP. So depending on the age of the student, in some states it's the age of 14, and some it's the age of 16, there'll be a transition plan. I will talk about transition a little bit more in a minute, but that is the future facing part of the document that's going to talk about what the plans are for after a child graduates high school or turns 21. Some students have behavior plans as part of their IEP. There's sometimes English language learner plans and services. Braille instruction is included in the IEP and what that's going to look like. Any communication needs, interpreters, things like that. And assistive technology. So FM systems, any magnifiers or anything like that that's going to be necessary for the student to be able to access the curriculum with their peers. A little more about transition planning. I could go on and on about transition planning. It's a common cause of IEP conflict. And so I think it's really important for us to understand all the different components of it. And so I'm not going to get into all of that today, but I think the important part that I wanted to mention is what is IEP transition planning and why is it important? So this is important for the family and the student to be thinking about early on about what do we want for the future. And we can start having these discussions, like I said, very early on. They can change all the time, but I think it's important for the entire IEP team, not just to be thinking about this year, but thinking forward into the future about what do we want? Do we want, is the dream for our child to be able to go to college, to live independently, to learn certain life skills. What are those goals and objectives for the future? And if we know what those are and we're communicating those as an IEP team, it's going to be so much easier for us to determine and map backwards to develop IEP goals that are really going to be effective and important and relevant for a student. So we should ask, what will the student be doing after high school? Is the goal for them just to be living at home with their families? Is the goal for them to be in college? Is the goal for them to be able to have some independent living skills more than they have? And how are we going to get there? So what goals are necessary in order for us to get there? And we might need to start at a young age in order to get there. And then most importantly, who's going to help the student achieve these goals, and how and when are these things going to be done? So this all it's a complicated process, and it takes a cooperative partnership. And this partnership is between a student and his or her family, the school, and post-school personnel. So a lot of times it's the vocational rehabilitation agency or the services for the blind agency that might be involved at this point in time. Local community representatives, a representative talking about supported employment, for instance, giving support on independent living skills, life skills. What does that look like? Potentially involving employers as well, just to get some feedback on what that might look like. And so all of this planning allows a student to choose a living arrangement, obtain a career if that's appropriate, develop independent and community living skills, and access post-secondary education if that is appropriate for a student. And how are they going to move from the school to the adult world, and what's that going to look like? And again, you can see how each one of our kids who is deafblind has unique needs. And so this is going to absolutely look different for everyone. There's a continuum, and what's right for one family and one student is going to be very different than what's right for another. So all of this involves thinking past high school. It should be individualized, outline the entire school experience. Really, really important for it to be student driven. So person-centered planning. The professionals should not be driving this. The families should be involved, but we should try to make this student driven. It should be about the student dreams and goals as much as possible. Based on students' abilities, but then also being realistic about any deficiencies so those can be addressed. And this is just really important that it's not this transition planning is not an add-on activity. For our oldest son, his transition planning, it really felt like this was just an added-on activity. It was just checking off the box on an IEP. We didn't have a robust discussion. We did not add team members in to talk about this. And so I felt like we were behind the ball a little bit on transition planning. We ended up with really positive outcomes for our son, but we had a lot of catch up to do in order to get there. So I think it's really important for this to be a long-standing discussion about transition, not just something that we spend 5 minutes on in an IEP meeting talking about what the future is going to look like. And again, this is more than just paperwork. Just like an IEP is more than just paperwork, this is about the student and the student's future. Again, very important that a student participate in their IEP as early as possible. If we're able to do this, it's going to make transition planning at the age of 14 or 16 so much easier, because we're going to be starting to have those conversations and involve the student and keeping the IEP very student-centered. Planning early, starting asking questions in the middle of high school or even sooner. We started for our second child talking about these in elementary school with him. Help the student talk about their dreams and goals. It's just important to hear where they're at. And so that, this can change frequently, but asking them and helping them talk about it. It should be based on preferences, interests, needs, and strengths, not just the deficits and, gosh, that's not possible. We should try to, as much as possible, think about this as being a strengths-based approach. Make sure we have measurable post-secondary goals and they express what the student wants to do. Work on job skills for employment then should be included in an educational program. So not just thinking about academics, but what is a student going to need in order to be in a certain career pathway? And prepare the student to know about the supports and services that they might need and how to ask for those after high school to assist with college coursework or job accommodations or modifications. How are they going to ask for that and know what they need? So I get asked a lot about what is this all about, accommodations and modifications? So I talked about that earlier. This is one of the things that's included in an IEP in order to ensure that a student is able to access the general education curriculum. So there are state and federal laws and regulations that require students to provide accommodations and modifications to make sure the students have access to the appropriate education. So these accommodations and modifications can either be part of an IEP or a 504 plan. So what these are actually leveling the playing field. So I love this visual. So it's not just equity, meaning everybody's going to receive, or equality, meaning that everybody is going to receive the same accommodations and supports. This is about equity, and this is meaning that everyone has access to the same content curriculum as everyone else. So this means that accommodations and modifications are going to be individualized. So some may need no accommodations and modifications, and others might need a lot. So the focus should be always on equity and not equality. So I love this visual about what's the difference between accommodations and modifications. So accommodations, I like to think about, this means changing the how a student, the grading is the same. So we're not changing the standards in what a student is learning, we're changing how the student is learning it. So potentially adding some examples are providing extra time on a test or homework, large print on a test or something like that. So these are how a student is learning, maybe ebooks, speech to text, things like that. Modifications, on the other hand, is changing the what. Grading potentially is different. What they're learning might be different. So it's changing the standards in regards to the instructional level or the content. Some more differences. Accommodations focus on removing barriers and providing access to the general curriculum. These are designed for students who have barriers that can be removed to help them demonstrate what they know. So for instance, that time and a half, maybe a student has the ability to access the general education curriculum, but maybe it just takes them a little bit longer to process. They need extra time in order to do that. They need large print or other assistive technology or other things in place in order for that to happen. That's where accommodations come into play. Modifications, on the other hand, the focus is on ensuring meaningful participation in the general education classroom. So the modifications are really designed for a student who would benefit from participation in the gen ed classroom, even though it's above their ability level. So, making sure that we have, that we're making adjustments to the curriculum so that the student can feel successful. A little bit ago, I was talking about the development of goals and how important those are. So when we talk about goals in an IEP, we're talking about developing what we call SMART goals. So what I mean by SMART goals are that they're specific, measurable, actionable, realistic or relevant, and time limited. So what does this all mean? So I like this IEP goal formula because I think a lot of times families and IEP teams, so a lot of the conflict might occur because we don't have goals that are SMART. So oftentimes I hear families in IEP teams in conflict because potentially the IEP goals are not achievable. Maybe the IEP goals do not change year to year. And maybe we should be looking at the fact that, well, maybe those are not the right goals at this point in time. And if that's the case, we need to be meeting as an IEP team and revising those goals. So it's important for us to think about it. So an example would be, first you start by a time frame. So by the end of the 2021 school year, the student will be able to write at a certain level in whatever setting. Where is this going to be in the classroom, or where will we visualize and see this? How will we measure it? So measured by the progress as indicated by the general education teacher with 85% accuracy with what supports. So it's important for us to focus on the time frame. How are we going to do this? How are we going to measure this? In what setting? And when you think about it, if you don't talk about it being specific enough with like how much accuracy and with what supports and who's going to measure it, it's very hard for us to be able to envision how we're going to measure the progress effectively. So it's really important for us to get the writing of these goals correct. Okay, so switching gears a little bit about parent experiences in the special education system. I've done a lot of research on families and their experiences in the IEP team, and then also what leads to conflict. So past research indicates, as we all can relate to, IEP teams are stressful, especially during times of transition. Now, when I talk about times of transitions, I'm not talking just about the transition age of 14 to 16. I'm talking about the transition from IFSPs to an IEP. There's a lot of emotions that happen there because an IFSP is very family oriented. An IEP is about the student. And so sometimes families can feel really overwhelmed about the shift between an IFSP being very family focused to an IEP being very student focused. So that's an important transition. Also, it's an important transition every single year for our students because deafblindness is such a low incidence disability that oftentimes teachers and others on an IEP team are not knowledgeable about deafblindness. And so every year or every time a new team member is involved added to the team, this is always the transition. And so during all those transitions, it's really important to ensure that everyone on the team has knowledge about the individual student's needs and about deafblindness. To do that, sometimes it's important for us to, sometimes us as family members need to educate the new team members about deafblindness and the child's individual needs. This can be done. I know we've done it with an About Me. Ava's Voice has a great template for that. We've done, for our IEP teams, had our kids do PowerPoint presentations to their peers, to their teachers. I've done in services as well. Sometimes the teacher of the deaf and teacher of the visually impaired will do a presentation with the IEP teams about deafblindness and the specific needs. So it can really vary, but it's important to really focus on making sure we get those transitions right. And for some students, even that transition is maybe there's a substitute that day, a teacher or a nurse or someone else that's really critical to um, a student's experience in the classroom, and maybe they're sick that day, maybe there's a substitute. And so every single transition is really important to be thoughtful about. We know the special education system, I talked a little bit about the law, but we just scratched the surface. You can see how this can be really overwhelming and confusing for families. I know all of us have probably received the procedural safeguard paper during an IEP team meeting, but oftentimes, I don't know about you, but that piece of paper that we receive is very overwhelming. It's not written in parent-friendly language, and it can lead to us feeling overwhelmed and confused about special education law. Parents feel like there's often a power imbalance. Oftentimes, you hear stories about parents walking into an IEP meeting and everybody else is sitting on the other side of the table, and there's a huge team and then there's one or two family members. That can really feel like a power imbalance. And so there are things that we can do as an IEP team to ensure that families feel like an equal part of the team. We know, I've done a lot of research on conflicts that can occur. Conflict can occur if families feel like their voices are not heard. If they feel like the team is not respecting the knowledge that they bring about their specific child and about deafblindness and about what's going on at home. And then transitions are very important as well. I talk about the 7 principles of effective partnership in the course I teach at University of Northern Colorado. Blue Banning and colleagues back in 2014 did a study of many parents, focus groups with many parents, and really looked at what factors contribute to families feeling like there is collaboration in an IEP team. And these are the 7 factors, principles that came out of that. Communication. So is how often and how are we communicating between everyone on the team? Professional competence. So do we have qualified personnel? Is there somebody who's deafblind and understands deafblindness on the team? Is an intervener appropriate? Are there qualified special education personnel on the team? And the next one is commitment. So how committed is the IEP team? I talked to a lot of families, and just being able to text a teacher, after hours if there's a question or concern. Parents often don't, will only use that if they have to, but just feeling like somebody's committed, going above and beyond. In COVID, just those examples of educators dropping supplies off to families, showing that they're committed and care about both the family and the student. Making sure that, it's really important that educators and IEP team members, if they see something that's not right, or they're, wondering if it's not right, advocating for a student, advocating and bringing something up. If you see something, bring it up and advocate for us to look at, maybe we need to change something or problem solve, make some changes. And equality. So feeling like parents feeling like they're not just participating in an IEP team meeting, but being an equal partner in the decision making, feeling like their voice is heard. And then respect. So feeling like if a family communicates something's going on, or talks about something, that they're respected. And respect is more broad as well. So respecting, families' culture, life experiences, and all the things that, family systems are very complex, and it's important for us to all respect what we all bring to an IEP team. And you can see how all of these things impact trust, because if we don't have trust, if trust breaks down, you can see how that can turn to conflict quite easily. All of us who have children who are deafblind often have large IEP teams. Often some of these teachers or related service providers are itinerant. They aren't always in the school building, making communication and collaboration sometimes challenging. But if we focus on these 7 principles and good communication and commitment and building that trust, it can go a long way, and it can improve satisfaction of families of the IEP process, and that ultimately leads to improved student outcomes. So next up, I wanted to talk about deafblind specific parent experiences. So I've done some research with families looking at the specific challenges that parents of students who are deafblind have when working with IEP teams. The first thing is professionals misunderstanding student needs. So I talked about this earlier. So oftentimes, a student who is deafblind, maybe a school or district has never had another student who's deafblind in their district because it's such a low incidence disability. Even if they have, the likelihood is that student will need, each student needs individualized services and supports. So if we don't think about the individualized need, professionals can easily misunderstand the needs. This is where the importance of bringing in somebody who really understands deafblindness, involving your state deafblind projects, advocating for an intervener if that's appropriate, and families really being able to feel respected and feel like they're able to communicate their understanding and what they know about what their students' strengths and needs are. There's also, this goes hand in hand, but a lack of professional knowledge. So parents taking on a role of case manager, oftentimes, parents are the ones who are, case managers, both from the medical side, but also the education side. So they're the ones communicating, the updates from the eye doctor on the progress, the progression of the vision loss. They're the ones who are intimately involved often in bridging that gap. Oftentimes, they're the ones who are they're communicating directly with all of the related service providers, and this can, sometimes feel overwhelming. Because I was talking about the fact that oftentimes these related service providers are itinerant or not in the building all the time. A lot of the service providers are not able to see each other in person. And so oftentimes the families are taking on that role of making sure that everybody is collaborating on the goals so that, if multiple different service providers are working on self-advocacy, for instance, that they're not working on, they're working on complementary things, but they're not both doing the same thing. Making sure that we have interveners or qualified personnel who understand deafblindness on the team. And, again, making sure that we're bringing in support from our deafblind projects or others who understand deafblindness. I think because of all this, I hear from families that they need to push for services. And I think this comes from a lack of knowledge of the individualized needs. The parents oftentimes, they trust their gut. They know what they're seeing at home. They understand that they're seeing some change or and a need. And so they're advocating for those services and supports. And oftentimes it can feel overwhelming for families to be doing this because they oftentimes feel like they are not understood. There's also a challenge that parents have expressed that goals are oftentimes not appropriate. I talked about this a little bit when we were going over SMART goals, but these are some things that I've heard from families. For some families, they hear things like, well, your child is deafblind, so honors classes are not appropriate for children like yours. For other families, I hear things like, your child doesn't have the communication skills to do what other kids are doing. And I hear how frustrated that families can sometimes get because they see that their child has strong communication skills at home. Perhaps they're using their AAC device more effectively at home, being able to communicate their needs and wants, but that's not happening at school. And so if we're not seeing that happen in both settings, it's really difficult and sometimes challenging for, sometimes the teams think that the communication goals need to be lower than families might think that they need to be. Again, oftentimes there's not enough future focus on those goals. So I was talking about this when we were going over transition, but this is the case every year, no matter how old your child is. So I think it's important for us to talk about not just what are the goals this year that we want, but like thinking forward between, for the next 5 years plus. When I talk with families about when's the appropriate time for Braille instruction, thinking through, well, gosh, maybe we should focus on Braille instruction this year and really hit it hard, because maybe next year we're anticipating that the child will be really learning those early literacy skills or something like that. And so, you can see how it's really important to kind of map out the next couple of years a little bit and really think about that as we're developing those annual goals. And that's going to help us really develop appropriate goals for a student. Oftentimes families get really frustrated with the lack of understanding of teams, of communication abilities. Talked about this already, but I think a lot of times families get frustrated that IEP teams underestimate the communication abilities of a particular student. Professionals often, I hear from families that professionals don't value communication mode. This comes into play very frequently during that transition from an IFSP to an IEP, when families are looking for appropriate preschools for their children. Oftentimes in schools or districts have specific deaf and hard of hearing programs or development preschools that may or may not have the appropriate communication mode that the family has chosen. And so, it's important to value the families, what the family's wants and desires are for communication mode when determining placement and least restrictive environment for each student. Sometimes it's a challenge because students are unable to communicate their needs directly. This can vary for each individual student, but perhaps they don't have the self-advocacy skills to advocate for what they need. And sometimes, students just don't know what they're missing. They don't know what they don't know. So if a student has a visual impairment and a hearing loss, they may not know if they've missed they've missed hearing something or seeing something because they didn't hear or see it. Oftentimes there's a large team of service providers, and so that can be really overwhelming and challenging for parents of children who are deafblind. Parents can feel sometimes isolated with a lack of access to other families who have similar experiences, especially in the school or district itself. There are definitely emotional impacts, as we're going through all this at families. And so that's why I think where this family to family support and networking really is important. Also having, the networking with adults who are deafblind really can help with some of those emotional impacts as well. These impacts are on the entire family. When I think about my siblings in our family, I think about also the impact on them as well. They're always watching out for our children who are deafblind. And I think it's just important to realize that all of this not only has impacts on the student themselves and the parents or guardians, but also the entire family, grandparents, siblings, and others. And then again, really can be a lot of conflict and stress around transitions, not just like I mentioned, the post-secondary transition, but every transition, a new member of the IEP team or each year, that kind of thing. So I wanted to go over some common questions that I get. The first one is, when should my child's IEP qualification be deafblindness? And I urge people to try as much as possible to advocate for their child's IEP qualification to be deafblind as soon as possible. It's going to help the states be able to identify the needs for the state deafblind projects to have the appropriate funding, for the schools and districts to have appropriate funding in order to support our children. And it's going to help with the need for qualified personnel in the field of deafblindness. And it's just going to help our children be able to have the appropriate services and supports necessary for them in the future. I talked with a lot of parents whose children are young and don't, they have a progressive vision loss. But at that point in time, they're discussing this with their IEP team, their child has very little vision loss. But I urge IEP teams, like I talked about earlier, to think about the future needs. Think about bringing a teacher of the visually impaired onto the IEP team, on the earlier side, because sometimes families and IEP teams don't know when they may want, that expertise at the teacher of the visually impaired. And so questions 1 and 2, kind of go hand in hand here. Both when should my child be qualified under deafblindness, and also when should I bring a teacher of the visually impaired to my IEP team? And so my answer to both of those is as early as possible, because there are things that a teacher of the visually impaired can do early on. They can work on the expanded core curriculum. They can work on self-advocacy skills. They can help parents understand, deafblindness and the impacts and the potential impacts in the classroom and what to look for. They can be on a consult basis with teachers. They can go watch and observe the child in the classroom and see, recommend different seating and other supports that might be necessary. And they can connect families with resources that are going to help them better understand the vision loss. Because, as part of all of this, families feel like they're often, many times alone in finding out resources about, whether it's Usher syndrome or whatever the cause of deafblindness is, and deafblindness overall. It can be really overwhelming for a family to feel like they have to do the research on special education law, deafblindness, the specific cause of the deafblindness, and all of these things. And so, the earlier that we can bring in a teacher of the visually impaired to help educate and bring resources to families and the rest of the team on that visual impairment aspect is really important. And then, also the other thing to come into play is to think about, as we're thinking about an IEP being future-based, thinking ahead for 5 years and, talking through to a family about when the appropriate time to talk about Braille instruction, when to introduce a white cane. For my youngest child, because we knew that he had Usher syndrome at birth, which was different than my oldest, we introduced him to the white cane and started teacherly visually impaired services and orientation mobility at a very young age, at the age of 2 or 3. And that was very simple at the time. We got him a white cane. We taught him very basic skills and just, making sure that he got comfortable with what a white cane is, just to avoid any stigma in the future, later on. I mentioned this a minute ago, but the next question is, when's the appropriate time to focus on the expanded core curriculum? I'm going to talk about the expanded core curriculum on the next slide. But I really think, it's important for us to focus on not just the academics of a student, but also the other things. So the expanded core curriculum is a curriculum. There's 9 focus areas for children with visual impairments. And there are things other than academics that we can be focusing on. Self-determination, like making sure students are have agency over their own choices. is one of those things. And so you can see how that, for instance, is something that we can work on with a child who's even preschool age, helping give them choices about what they're going to wear each day, choices on what's going on in their day. And these are things that teachers of the visually impaired and other team members can be working on with students at a very young age. So I also get many questions around the transition from an IFSP to an IEP and what to expect. I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but I do want to mention that this is definitely a source of a lot of stress and confusion for families. I already mentioned earlier on in this presentation about the fact that an IFSP is very family-centered and an IEP is student-centered. And so it's a lot of change for a family. And I think it's really important to provide appropriate support for the family during this time. The support can come from other family members, other families that families may know that can network with, that have been through this process, the State Deafblind Project, or really anyone. But I think it's important to, and I think it's important for others on the IEP team to recognize that this is a really important process, important point in time, and can be really stressful. And to, try to, as much as possible, to make that process as smooth as we can. The next question I often get is an intervener right for my child? I think oftentimes schools and districts, many states don't have a lot of interveners. This is one of the problems in our field of deafblindness. I'm going to talk about interveners more in a minute and give an example of what that is. But I think it's really important for the IEP team to be talking about that as an individualized discussion. The National Center for Deafblindness has a guide for IEP teams it's a great guide. It's that I will give the link to, but it gives things for IEP teams to talk about. What are the communication strengths? What are other things and challenges that students are having in the classroom? And it really helps guide the discussion of whether or not an intervener might be appropriate for a child. The next question I get is, when should my child start to be involved in their IEP team meeting? And I think as early as possible. I know that I've done some research in this area, and I can tell you that our IEP process, personally, when I started involving my youngest son at the age of 9 in this IEP team, has improved drastically since I involved him. At the age of 9, we were struggling with getting him an additional diagnosis. We were noticing that in addition to deafblindness, we were noticing that he was having some other challenges. And so we were wondering about learning disabilities and potentially some attention issues. I brought that up with his IEP team, and I was having a really hard time getting my point across and making sure that what I was seeing at home was communicated properly to the IEP team. Started to have a lot of conflict with the IEP team at that point in time. So instead of getting really, really frustrated, I instead decided to involve Dalton in his IEP team. And it was the most amazing thing I did. I asked him, taught him how to communicate with his IEP team about his frustrations in the classroom, about what he was feeling, about the accommodations and support that he felt he needed. So he went into his IEP team and described this directly. And after doing that, the team was willing to do additional assessments and evaluations in order to determine that additional diagnosis on top of the deafblindness. And so that student involvement can be really powerful, and it can help a parent feel like they don't have to take on that entire burden on themselves if we're able to do this. So I understand that every child doesn't have the same ability to be involved in the IEP meetings as others. It's a very individualized, each child is individual and that may look different, but the more we can at least have them there, keep it student centered, even at a young age, even at early elementary, I think it's going to help in the future. Some parents say that, yeah, I'm concerned that my my child has a disability other than deafblindness. How do I convey that to my IEP team so they can be evaluated? Again, just trust your gut. And, I just told a story about our personal experience with this, but my personal, the more I share about our personal experience, I realize how I'm not alone in this. Oftentimes our children are diagnosed with deafblindness and they're put into that category. And it's really hard to get IEP teams to understand that potentially some of the challenges that a child might be experiencing in the classroom are not vision or hearing related. They could be related to something else, such as a learning disability or something else. So it's just trust your gut, communicate, and try different ways. For me, it was, using my child to be able to describe what was going on. And that was the key to get the team to really understand what was going on for him. How do I determine what accommodations and modifications are appropriate for my child? And, again, this is an individualized discussion. This should be happening in the IEP team. But oftentimes for our children, I know this is true for us, that situations change all the time. If we're only meeting once a year as an IEP team and putting accommodations or modifications in place, oftentimes I find for families of children who are deafblind that that's not frequent enough because situations can change. Perhaps the classroom changes. Maybe the seating in the classroom, maybe the HVAC unit, for instance, all of a sudden got really loud and the placement of the seating in the classroom needs to get changed. Maybe a child is experiencing a lot of stress going on. This is particularly appropriate with COVID, as we are all dealing with a lot of stress. But you can see how individual circumstances can change frequently. And so it's important for IEP teams to address and change, problem solve and address changes to accommodations and modifications on an ongoing basis. So this is a visual of what the expanded core curriculum involves. So you can see core academics is in the middle here. So that's what we really think about when we think about special education, I think, overall as a field. But for a child who has a visual impairment, there is the expanded core curriculum that covers all these other areas. So career education, what can we do to prepare a child for a career? Compensatory access. So how do we make sure that they have access to everything they need in order to access academics? Sensory efficiency, maybe there's things that a child needs in order to address any sensory issues that are going on. What assistive technology is appropriate? And I know it's not just, we talked about an IEP talking about assistive technology, but it's also important to train a student about how to use this technology. Oftentimes I hear from families that they receive assistive technology, but their child doesn't know how to use the AAC device, doesn't know how to use the FM system independently, how to use the magnification system, those kinds of things. And so it's important for us to teach students how to use all of those things and how to determine what's appropriate depending on the certain environment. Orientation and mobility, things like cane training. Social interaction, I know this is a challenge. This has definitely been a challenge for our kid or my own personal kids, is how do we work with the kids in order to, work on, how to socialize with their peers. Recreation is also really important. How do we not just think about academics, but giving students the opportunity to be involved in sports or other things in addition to academics. Also focusing on independent living, those life skills, feeding, toileting, cooking, all of these things. And then lastly, self-determination, and I was mentioning that earlier. That's been a focus of my research. And what I found is that self-determination and working on those skills is absolutely possible at a young age for our children. And, it might just look different. It might just look like, giving a child a choice between, what they're going to eat. Would you like green beans or broccoli for a vegetable? And letting them make some of those decisions. I also stated that I wanted to talk a little bit more about interveners. So what are they? There's more information on the National Center for Deafblindness website with that guide, but really interveners provide access to information, communication, and facilitate the development of the social and emotional well-being of our children. These intervener services are provided by an individual, typically a para-educator, who's received specialized training in deafblindness and the process of intervention. And so there's specific training for interveners, and that is becoming more and more prevalent. And so if a school or district is interested in learning more about that training, there's more information on the National Center on Deafblindness' website. So an intervener is providing consistent one-on-one support to a student who's deafblind, ages 3 through 21 throughout the instructional day. And so I think it's, it's definitely not something that is as common as I would like it, that we all would like it to be. But I think it's important for us to start having that conversation about, what that might look like. And if an intervener is not appropriate, how do we ensure that all of our children have access to the general education or the curriculum with their peers as much as possible, and that we have the services and supports in place to ensure that. So to conclude, families, it's important to recognize the important role that you play in all of this, and listen to your gut. If something doesn't feel right, or you feel like the team needs to hear something, speak up and listen to that gut. And if people are not listening, keep at it. Communicate. Other IEP team members, I think it's important to understand that these are large IEP teams. Often these students who are deafblind have very individualized needs, and that takes very strong collaboration. If we are able to have that strong collaboration, it's going to lead to increased parent satisfaction, which then in turn is going to lead to improved student outcomes. I also really urge people, I brought this up earlier, to share an about me to everyone on the team before school starts and any transition. I'm happy to, if anybody wants to reach out, I'm happy to share some examples of some of the PowerPoint presentations that I've done for my child's teams. And they can just be a piece of paper about strengths and challenges and what works in the classroom. Or it can be, like I said, a PowerPoint or other type of presentation. So it can look very different and customized to your needs. But to end it all, communicate. Because our children have unique and individualized needs, communication is more important than ever. I'm going to leave you with a lot of these resources that are here to support you. I'm listing here both deafblind specific resources and also general special education law resources. I'm also available at any point in time. Feel free to reach out to me on my website, laneofinquiry.org. And I'm happy to set up a time to meet individually with anyone, train individual IEP teams, just schools and districts about deafblindness and some of the unique needs in the IEP process. Thank you so much and have a great day.